Did you know the 501st Trooper has the wrong markings in the original Battlefront 2? All standard units in this legion are shown to have blue stripes running down their legs, even in the game's cover art. Although this looks like a mistake, the game's model is actually inspired off early designs from Episode 3. In fact, unlike in the reboot where each legion shares the same armor across the 4 classes with just slightly different markings, mostly created by DICE, the original games based each class on early versions of Clone Trooper skins we saw in the films. Commander Bakara originally had a white waist cape like the Heavy. Commander Gree first used the game's Jet Trooper gear, which is why his camo variant has the same chrome shine and green visor. Plus, these were the original Kashyyyk Troopers accompanied with Commander Neo and Gree, while the Clone Engineers Commander Faye was originally on Saleucami with white Clone Marines. Interesting since both armor sets are clearly inspired off Stormtrooper gear. Though, that's not to say the reboot's markings don't have any inspiration either. The Clone Jet Troopers were briefly shown in the Clone Wars TV show a few times before Season 7's 501st reskin, and some officers and heavy classes resemble commanders seen across the prequels. Plus, the reboot also introduced the standard Phase 2 variant for the 41st Elite Corps, which previously only had green Phase 1 armor shown off in the Clone Wars. Although they were shown in Episode 3 with grey markings on Coruscant, that's just one of many subdivisions in this battalion. Battlefront 2 also canonized the Kashyyyk Scout Trooper unit as a separate division to the Ranger Platoon. These skins were originally labeled as the 41st Elite Corps in earlier versions of Battlefront 2 until non-camouflaged variants were eventually added, which led to the creation of the 41st Ranger Platoon subdivision. The older version of this skin was also a brighter green and looked the same across each class. This was later changed to a more brown tone with unique markings across the classes, and they even have a Phase 1 variant. But just like how some of the skins DICE created eventually became canon through merchandising, many of the movie's unused models were released as toys alongside the launch of Episode 3 with added lore and a proper Legion ID, and or adapted in future shows or other types of media, with the exception of Commander Bly, which was just changed to a regular clone commander. The original 212 pan was green, but later became the 442nd Siege Battalion from the toys, making its way to the Battlefront 2's promotional poster as well. But sometimes it's hard to tell if a figure's design was made just for merchandising or from the film's cut content, since most of the unused data from the prequels were digitally stored and probably now lost. Speaking of which, the only pilot skins we get in the reboots are the Rebel Orange jumpsuit from the first game and the Blue Droid skins from the sequel, which means we still haven't seen modern versions of these units. The closest thing we get is Iden Versio's Inferno Squad gear, since it's basically the same as the Imperial pilot with just red markings. But although you can't see through the cockpit of some starfighters like the TIE series and the CIS fighters since they were piloted by AI, for some reason the cockpit of the Rebel and Republic starships are visible and completely empty on the home screen, but have pilot models while in game. It sucks we don't get to use the clone pilot at all or see the skin up close. It would have been a great opportunity since we already have a model of Tamara Morrison's face for the clone officer, and for some reason the V-Wing has a white Phase 1 clone trooper as its pilot, which is pretty weird because the V-Wing was introduced at the later ends of the Clone Wars and was a precursor to the Imperial TIE Fighter, sharing similar engine sounds and overall theme. And the pilots were originally meant to have enclosed helmets resembling the Imperial design, while the ARC 170 pilots had the open visors we saw in Revenge of the Sith. This skin was only ever shown off in the Micro series and, according to the wiki, was intended to be in the original Battlefront 2. Unlike in the original games, where you can hear battle droid pilots communicating once you hop in a CIS starship, the reboot is more lore accurate, having the higher pitched voices of the starships since they were automatically piloted by AI and not B1 units. Each ship even has its own eyes, and going into first person mode shows us the infrared view that droid photoreceptors usually have as seen with the BX Commando. Plus, just as a quick tip, you can actually look backwards while flying starships. Not only can you get some really cool shots, but this even works in first person mode, so don't forget to give this a go. And before moving on to the next fact, can we just appreciate how gorgeous space battles and the ship models look in this game? From the cockpit view that gets lit up by a fighter's shot to the planets far off in the distance. Everything looks better than in the films at this point, so hopefully future Battlefront games can make better use of the space battles because it has so much potential. You probably noticed that the Vulture droid is yellowy brown while the other two CIS ships rock a blue paint job. That's because all the yellow painted ships represent Nute Gunray's Trade Federation as seen in episode 1 with the MTTs and AATs. But as Count Dooku's government, the CIS, partnered and adopted much of the technology of the Trade Federation, they started marking these reinforcements with blue and with the iconic CIS logo. In Battlefront 2, some vehicles do get both versions, while the Hyena Bomber and Tri-Fighters were only ever shown with the CIS flag since they were introduced later in the Clone Wars. But for some reason, this skin was never added for the Vulture droid, making the original Battlefront 2 the only game in the series to include its episode 3 appearance, which is pretty funny because even the Micro series had the other ships colored blue, but the Vulture droid still yellow. Speaking of which, you might have not noticed that some weapons in the Battlefront games aren't shown in the movies. The droid Sniper, for example, first made an appearance in the Clone Wars Micro series with a very rapid fire rate. Although it's a regular sniper in the games, it does have one of the most unique weapon designs by far. And while the Rebel snipers use the DLT-20A in both the original and reboot, the Clone and Imperial sniper rifles were created for the classic Battlefront games to my knowledge. And the reboot specialist classes for these factions do also use similar looking weapons, which could mean they took inspiration. Plus, the Rebel and Imperial rocket launchers from the originals were also created for the games, while the Clone PLX launcher and the CIS's E60R were both introduced in the Micro series. Though this was later retconned in the Clone Wars, having the Clone Heavies use RPS launchers and the Super Battle Droids use cannon arms instead of heavy B1 units with rocket launchers. Though the PLX rocket still made an appearance in the Clone Wars toys for some reason. And because this was all over the place, DICE decided to use the Smart Rocket for all human factions, which was first introduced in the reboot's Battlefront 1. You might have also noticed that the ARC Troopers from the original games look very different to the ones in the reboot. That's because they were inspired off the ones seen in the Micro series known as the Alpha Class ARC Troopers, which wear Phase 1 gear completely along with a pauldron and waist cape and were trained by Jango Fett himself along with adopting much of the Mandalorian culture. Their DNA was also specifically changed to be superior to the regular clone troopers, while the ARC Troopers that followed were generally normal clones that climbed through the ranks. The reboot's ARC Troopers were inspired off these types of clones since they have the prototype Phase 2 helmet from the Clone Wars, as well as having double shoulder pauldrons and a split waist skirt, which was again designs from the Clone Wars TV show. And although the game does give you an option for a Phase 1 helmet, something just doesn't look right since this combination was never seen in the TV series. Plus, the ARC Troopers were given a backpack in the Clone Wars which looks very similar to the one the Imperial Sand Troopers used in episode 4. And as a side note, the reboot gives this unit a melee combo that uses the back of their pistols to attack. But there's so much more hidden details about hero skins and other factions like the CIS in the reboot. Find out more in this video.